Yes. Okay. Yes. Hi, everyone on Zoom. They can see me, right? Yes. Okay, great. So I was also going to say I won't be able to stay throughout for the entire event because I have another meeting to go to. But after my presentation, I'll be able to take the questions and hopefully provide some answers. But let's go on first to the opening remarks on my tiny little iPhone mini. I should have printed this out. Okay. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming. It's really wonderful to see so many of you in person post-COVID days, and also our attendees on Zoom. Welcome as well. So one of the wonderful things, I guess, about post-COVID period is we're able to have hybrid events. And in case you're wondering, this room is equipped with a camera and microphones. So please refrain from having any secret conversations because you may be accidentally picked up. I'm just kidding, all right? Okay, the Singapore Research Nexus, which has organized this event, was launched in 2011, and it's an initiative of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at NUS. So we use it to feature our researchers' work, which some of it focuses on Singapore, but also on the wider Southeast Asian region. And SRN, which Singapore Research Nexus, regularly hosts events like this to bring together interested participants like yourself to share in our researchers' work. So SRN is a useful tool for academics, policymakers, and those with a general interest in how research has helped shape the story of Singapore. SRN has collated thousands of academic publications, and those of you who are interested to have a look at it, you can also browse through the full text versions via NUS Scholar Bank. We've also added novels, plays, poems, and short films, creative works, all written by FASS faculty, students, past and present. And there is also a Singapore photo bank containing photographs of Singapore by the FASS community. And we are very pleased to make this resource public for faculty, students, as well as members of the public to use. SRN publishes weekly highlights of FASS research pertaining to Singapore. It has a Facebook page, and it organizes regular events like this to present faculty research and publications. We also have a collection of our researchers' grants, and the magazine is actually available outside for you to pick up if you'd like to have a look at it. So in these ways, SRN offers users a view of Singapore in all its diversity and complexity. So apart from today's events, we have a couple of other upcoming events. On the 11th of October, FASS hosts a brown bag seminar, and this will be a presentation by Assistant Prof. Kong Chien Wen from the Department of History. This will be held here in the same room, but it's also, if I'm not mistaken, hybrid and available on Zoom. You can check for details closer to the date. On the 13th of October, FASS has a distinguished lecture series in Buddhist studies, and this is by Professor James Robson from Harvard University. This event will be at the NUS Shaw Foundation House, which is next door. Registration will be via FASS's Eventbrite page, and this is an in-person event only. 1st of December, we have a book launch by Assistant Professor Seng Guo Qian from NUS History, and this will be at the Peranakan Museum. The registration will open in November on the Eventbrite page, and this will be an in-person event only. So on that note, I would also like to thank all of the presenters in advance for making time to come today. That's Weiqiang, Casey, as well as Chitra. Have I missed anyone? I hope not. All good? Yes. Right? And myself, I suppose. And of course, I have to thank Dylan for helping to chair. And on this note, I'm actually going to just introduce him briefly. So Dr. Dylan Brady is an assistant professor in the NUS Department of Geography. He's a human geographer who looks at questions of political and cultural change through the lens of infrastructure. He's working on interesting work right now on Singapore's digital infrastructure, if I may put it that way. His work speaks to three broad topics of broad interest within human geography: the fractured geographies of nationhood, the theorization of materiality in a modern human world, and the political economy of mobility in contemporary China. We look forward to when Dylan has new work to share with us on Singapore's digital infrastructure. But for now, he's kindly offered to chair the rest of the presentation. So let me hand the time over to him.
Hi, Elaine. Thanks very much for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and have a chance to moderate this session on infrastructure, not just as a technical, physical infrastructure, but as a social and cultural thing as well. So as Elaine told us, we have 4 speakers. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to speak and then a 10-minute Q&A. We'll start off with questions from the audience, but then also make space for questions from Zoom. So if you are on Zoom and you want to ask questions, please enter them into the chat. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elaine Ho. She is professor at the Department of Geography and senior research fellow at the Asia Research Institute. She is also currently vice dean at the FASS Research Division. Her research on the geographies of citizenship focus on 2 domains. First, transnational aging and care in the Asia Pacific, and second, diaspora engagement and diplomacy. Professor Ho's talk today addresses how the spatial restrictions and social distancing measures during COVID-19 were experienced by older adults as a spatial breach in their webs of care, impacting their ability to connect socially with others through social infrastructures. Without further ado, back to you, Dr. Ho.
Thank you. Can I have the slides, please? Thanks. So while Yok-Chuan's setting up, I just want to introduce my research team who's here today. There are actually 7 of us in total. Today, a few of them are here. So Lynn-Ee is here. She's our research assistant. Sam is a postdoc on the project. Siyao is also a postdoc on the project. Hong Kai was a former research assistant, and Grace is our PhD student. So I'm presenting on behalf of everyone today because the last time when we tried to do a combined presentation, which was actually, I think Tuesday, was it Tuesday? We exceeded time terribly. So today we're just going to focus on one person presenting. Okay, so today's presentation is on the social infrastructures of care. And we want to look at how COVID-19 actually can be read as a type of spatial breach, which also brings to view certain ways in which social infrastructures operate here in Singapore. Sorry, let me see. Okay. So today's presentation focus, as I mentioned, is on how what we call formal and informal social infrastructure shape and give meaning to older adults' everyday lives. So in today's presentation, we want to introduce to you, what do we mean by social infrastructures? What kinds of social infrastructures are there? And we also want to focus on how different kinds of social infrastructures become more or less significant when there are changes in one's social connectedness due to life circumstances, such as the impacts of COVID-19 on the lives of older Singaporeans. And then lastly, to what extent can personal agency address episodes of reduced social connectedness, and what role do social infrastructures play? So the term social infrastructures might be new to many of you. Normally, when we think about infrastructures, it's to deal with the built environment. But this term social infrastructures actually introduces ideas around social life, sociality, and it's people-centered. Okay, just for context, this presentation is based on a paper that's already been published in a journal. And at the end of it, we will show a QR code. If you're interested, you can scan the QR code and access the journal article. It's open access, so you don't need to be a subscriber to access it. In our paper, we actually engage with 3 sets of literature on, first of all, the well-being of older adults, particularly how they get around outside their homes. Secondly, on the ideas around care assemblages and what we call spatial breach. And then thirdly, on the literature on social infrastructure. So in terms of the literature on the well-being of older adults, some of the key ideas we engaged with in the paper was how mobility can in fact be seen as a therapeutic practice. Mobility is no longer just about getting from one place to another, but the very act of being mobile can actually be enriching to people. So for instance, during our fieldwork, when we did interviews, we hear of older adults, older Singaporeans will take long bus rides to get from one place to another because that act of mobility can feel therapeutic. Okay, secondly, we also want to talk about, or rather highlight, Wood et al.'s work on this idea of emotional synchronicity. So mobility can itself be a therapeutic practice. And when people get from one place to their destination, here what we want to focus on is when older Singaporeans get together, they have activities, and they feel that they develop a sense of emotional connectedness. Okay, so when COVID-19 happened, not only was mobility disrupted for them, but their ability to socially connect with others was disrupted too. In the second set of literature on care assemblages, we refer to earlier work that had been published by another research team that I had worked with using this term webs of care. And by the term webs of care, what we wanted to flag up was how people are embedded in wider relationships, okay, very similar to webs, right? So with different kinds of people and with kind of the lines emanating, in complex ways. So these webs of care actually provide support to older Singaporeans. However, COVID-19 disrupted some of these webs of care because they can no longer meet people and gather together for their social activities. So in another article by Butcher, they use this term spatial breach. And when they use this term, actually they were referring to how gentrification impacts people's ability to connect with their environments. But we adapted this term spatial breach to the context of COVID-19 because COVID-19 was in fact a spatial breach through the social distancing measures, restrictions on gatherings. It affected people's ability to get together in places and socially connect with one another. The third set of literature we looked at, I won't go into detail on all of them, the individual articles, but just to highlight that this term social infrastructure is actually embedded in a wider set of geographical literature. And here what we want to focus on is social infrastructures can refer to built environments, they can refer to programs, services, and how they come together to facilitate social life. But very importantly, as Simone and McQuaid, they argue, people also function as social infrastructures. So they use the term people as social infrastructure, which we found to be very inspiring for our work. And thirdly, in another set of literature on care, these authors refer to care as a form of infrastructure as well. So there's a wider set of literature that looks at infrastructure in social life. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, webs of care, okay, comes from works on care assemblages. And by webs of care, we refer to the interlinked chains that are created through social connectedness. And in this case, when we think about aging and older adults, it's about how they give and receive care, okay? And that process of giving and exchanging care actually connects them to other people in their webs of care. Older adults also cultivate emotional synchronicity as they engage in these care relationships. And that process of receiving and giving care actually enables a sense of ontological security. So the social infrastructures within their webs of care, okay, can provide material, financial, or emotional resources. And their access to resources can also enable or constrain their social connectedness. So to put it in Singaporean terms, being able to go to a social senior activity center as a social infrastructure can enable them to receive information, which are resources in their webs of care. But in that process, they may also be receiving care or giving care to other people in the senior activity center. Now, during spatial breaches like COVID-19, certain social infrastructures can become more prominent or recede in prominence as webs of care change. So COVID-19, for example, resulted in the closure of many social spaces for older adults, okay, and that can be considered a kind of spatial breach. But in that process, do other kinds of social infrastructure then become more prominent? So to answer these questions from the literature, as well as in the Singapore case, our research team carried out a project called Aging and Social Networks. Okay, and in this project, we use a mix of methods from a survey with 1199 older Singaporeans. The reason why it's not a nice number, 1,200, is because one person withdrew. Okay, and we carried out our research in Taman Jurong and in Hougang. So the survey actually sort of was focused on mapping the seniors' personal networks, measuring their network connectedness as well as their group connectedness by asking them to name the people in their social networks. So the PI, the co-PI who leads this is Associate Prof. Vincent Chua from Sociology, and he's not here today. So more detailed questions on like the survey findings, I'm afraid I won't be able to give you details, but I might be able to just give you some of the general findings we have. Okay, the second set of research methods we use were qualitative GIS. So from the survey, we did do macro GIS mapping. But the other thing which we did was qualitative GIS, where we got our research team carried out 3 additional stages of fieldwork, an opening interview with a subset of seniors from the survey in the 2 neighborhoods, accompanied by go-along interviews for 1 day. And they carried a 7 days mobile app, which enabled us to collect their GPS tracks. So then we were able to kind of map out, where the places they go to across those 7 days. Then we use those maps in the closing interview to try and deepen understanding why did you go to these places, who did you meet, what did you do there, etc. Okay, so I won't go into the rest of the details. Okay, I think I'm going to just skip over this slide in the interest of time, but basically it talks about why we decided to focus on Hougang as our second field site. Okay, so Taman Jurong was based on the previous research study that I mentioned. It was a qualitative project, and because of that, I became aware about how social networks feature and extend beyond the neighborhood. So we decided to carry out a second study that incorporates a survey as well as a comparative site in Hougang. Okay, I'm just going to skip over this to focus today really on the qualitative research findings. So in today's presentation, we're not covering the survey or the GIS itself, because if we did that, we would really take very, very long, as we found out on Tuesday. So today's presentation is about the qualitative ideas that help to develop this picture of social infrastructures. Okay, so social infrastructures to us can consist of what we call formal or informal social infrastructures. By formal, what we mean is usually these are social infrastructures that are sort of embedded within organizations that have like a vision and a mission, etc. So if you think about the senior activity centers, residence committees, community centers, they're all backed by some kind of organization, and they're very structured in the way they approach things. Informal social infrastructures to us are those that are more spontaneous, okay, and often resulting in more casual meetups, but nonetheless still very important in the lives of older Singaporeans. And these are coffee shops, hawker centers, pubs, etc. So both kinds of social infrastructures function as social support and platforms and resource exchanges for the older adults whom we studied. And social infrastructures, we argue, are actually keynotes in these webs of care, okay, that the older Singaporeans are embedded in. And what I think our key argument here is that we want to argue for the importance of having diverse social infrastructures. So a lot of government funding is pumped into the formal social infrastructures. But in our findings, what we want to highlight as well are the informal spaces where people connect, okay, and it provides forms of support Singaporeans as well. And the diversity of the social infrastructures are especially important when there are spatial breaches. So COVID-19 is like a mega spatial breach, right? It's affected populations all around the world, and there was like national measures taken to contain it. But spatial breaches can also happen on a more individualized level. So essentially, they are episodes in an older person's life that disrupts the way that they normally carry out life. So an injury that prevents them from going out, right? Or change financial circumstances. These can also result in spatial breaches in terms of what kinds of activities they can access or not. Okay, so this other slide is where we want to share with you some examples of how social infrastructures function as keynotes in the older Singaporeans' webs of care, right? Their relationships with other people. So both formal and informal social infrastructures create avenues for the older Singaporeans to cultivate social connections and emotional synchronicity with the people they meet at these social spaces. So one example that we want to share with you is of 82-year-old Han. He's male, widowed, and he lives in a 2-room flexi flat. So he would probably be considered someone who is sort of middle to lower income. Okay, he lives alone, but he actually makes a special effort to engage, okay, with people outside of the area where he stays. So most of the time, Han's case actually was quite surprising to us because many of our government policies assume that older people age in place and they use the facilities mainly in their neighborhoods. But Han's case was really interesting because even though he's in his 80s, he would actually take a bus ride and travel an hour or so, I think 3 times a week to go to a senior activity center that is much further from where he stays. So even though there are closer senior activity centers, over the years, he has maintained his participation in this one that's further because he says that he knows the people there. Okay, so this is why we say people as infrastructure is important, not just anybody, but a particular set of people that they feel deeply socially connected to. Okay, another example is of 83-year-old Nian. Okay, he is male, coincidentally widowed as well, 2-room HDB flat. And Nian actually used to stay in a 5-room flat, but due to his family circumstances, he has a sickly daughter, and to pay for her medical expenses, etc., he sold his 5-room flat, and they now stay in a 2-room flat. His daughter is actually bedridden, and he's the main caregiver. So what we found in our research was that he is someone who is potentially, a vulnerable older adult, but he had strong social connections around a church that he used to go to until COVID-19 happened. Okay, but during COVID-19, when people were allowed to visit, the church members would actually come to his home. So the church actually is outside of the neighborhood where he stays. Okay, but the other social infrastructure that's really important to him is actually a coffee shop near where he stays. It's a coffee shop he goes to regularly. And during our interviews with him, he told us that, the coffee shop friends that he made there, I'm not sure if the rest of you have this experience, right? But my father, he goes to the coffee shop and he never ever actually exchanged numbers with his friends there. So you wonder, how are you friends if you don't have one another's contacts? But apparently these casual, everyday meetups, results in a type of friendship, right? That is important to them in their regular routines, even though they may not connect over the phone. Okay, but the minute a neighbor doesn't show up, everyone kind of gets worried and then try to find out what's happened to the person, for example. So Nian's coffee shop friends actually were a very important resource to him when he had financial needs for his daughter's medical bills. And over the years, they've contributed thousands of dollars to help him with his financial needs. And they often also buy him meals to sort of support him. So these kinds of formal as well as informal social infrastructures, the picture we're trying to draw out here is how the older adults' regular activities in these kind of social spaces enable them to experience daily life in their neighborhood. And it's beyond just like going for an event. It's actually deeper than that. So in our project, we're still trying to get our head around how do we conceptualize this? How do we make sense of these fleeting everyday encounters that are nonetheless very important in the lives of older Singaporeans? Okay, so Han, as I mentioned earlier, during COVID-19, he experienced a spatial breach because he could no longer go to this multi-services center that was very much part of his everyday routine. He had no access to social services and facilities, and he experienced disruptions to his routines that used to structure and give purpose in his daily life. And actually, when the multi-services center was not operating, he found that his social circles had narrowed during the circuit breaker. But interestingly, even after the circuit breaker, he found he couldn't resume his social life, even though he wanted to, because his friends who are around the same age group as him, his friends' children were actually curtailing their parents from going out. So even though Han actually very much wanted to go out, to socialize with his friends, have meals together outside of the multi-services center. He couldn't do so anymore because of the restrictions that his friends' children had placed on them. So as he mentioned, the center used to provide a lot of activities with exercise, but due to COVID-19, a lot of things cannot be done. So it got really boring for him. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, the social distancing measures that were put in place to so-called protect older adults actually accentuated their isolation and vulnerability instead. Just checking on the time. Okay, so in episodes of spatial breach, right, what we also paid attention to was when we carried out this research, the circuit breaker was clearly over, okay, but some of the social restrictions, social distancing measures were still in place, and people were still gradually sort of easing into sort of socializing with one another. So when we carried out this research, right, we paid attention to how we asked them, how did you kind of like resume, your social life, right? And here in this paper, we talk about it as reassembling their webs of care, because during the circuit breaker and when strict social distancing measures were in place, they couldn't go out with their friends, they couldn't gather, have meals, etc. So for Ping, who is a 73-year-old female, also widowed, okay, this is real coincidence that they're all widowed. She's actually a very active Qigong instructor, extremely fit, and socially active. So prior to COVID-19, she told us, she would go out with her students, they would go on overseas trips together, even celebrate Chinese New Year together. So that really speaks to the depth of their ties. And she used to go for Qigong classes. She's an instructor. She used to teach it at community centers, in the void decks, etc. But all that was cut off, right, during COVID-19. So her webs of care actually, prior to COVID-19, comprised very much of her students and her peer instructors from the Qigong classes. When COVID-19 happened, she couldn't gather with them, but she made an effort, right? She made an effort to learn how to use Zoom, and she would organize Qigong classes via Zoom instead of on-site. So she actually acquired the digital capability and enabled her students to do so. And Zoom allowed her to continue to resume or to maintain a sense of social connectedness with the people in her webs of care. Okay, so she was motivated to re-engage because of her own personality. She's very sociable, but also her students' desire to maintain their fitness. So this is the reciprocal relationship that I was talking about earlier. All right. And Telegram became a new avenue for her to socially connect with her students. And she said, I was forced to learn, how to use Zoom. Initially, she was scared, okay, but then she got familiar. Her students, in turn, needed to submit videos to her as their homework. Okay, she's quite a strict instructor. And then she gives them instructions on how to improve. So through these kind of digital spaces, right, they reconnected virtually instead. And she reassembled her webs of care to maintain emotional synchronicity with her students and fellow instructors. All right, okay. So social infrastructures and the schemes by the government and social services, social service organizations also facilitate re-engagement. Okay, so these are, for example, formal government schemes and subsidies. So when older Singaporeans go and they join exercise sessions, sometimes they get like monetary incentives. Apparently, if someone told us went to Skills Future classes and got some money as well. I'm not sure how that worked. Okay, so there are lots of government, incentives and subsidies actually. And in Linda's case, okay, her webs of care really center around friends who would meet at the Senior Activity Center to socialize, learn, and gather new information together. Okay, so before COVID-19, she regularly used Skills Future credits to upskill and attend classes at various training sessions. During COVID-19, the SAC closed, which restricted her social activities. But once it reopened, she started to join outdoor Zumba and dance classes. So you can tell, she's very active, right? And she reflexively uses these social infrastructures and schemes to improve herself and to stay fit. Okay. So what these cases illustrate, and it's also a coincidence that the earlier two were men and the later two were females, okay? But their prior social networks actually encourage them to remain actively connected and they exercise personal agency, okay? So I want to give you the other side of the picture now. Yeah, because if you recall, one of our last questions or presentation focus that we said we'll address is whether personal agency itself is enough. And I think this is really important because sometimes we may romanticize by saying people can practice agency, but what we want to highlight here is there are limits to agency too. Okay, so for example, Kiet, before COVID-19, she joined group activities in Singapore. She used to travel overseas with her friends, and these pre-pandemic webs of care were very much centered around formal social infrastructures activities. Okay, I need to speed up a bit because of time. During COVID-19, she started to withdraw a bit, okay, because of fear of getting the virus. But most importantly, she said even after activities resumed, she did not go back to it with as much fervor as before. Why? Because her friends were also starting to withdraw. They were not participating as much. So what we wanted to highlight is the older Singaporeans' personal agencies intertwined with those of their friends and vice versa. Another case, 62-year-old Samuel, he also experienced changes in his social connectedness in his webs of care. Okay, during the pandemic, he goes to church regularly, goes with extended family members, has his friends there. So during the pandemic, many of these activities were suspended, okay, and he misses them, okay? And he says even outside of church, his family members used to gather for meals together, okay? But gradually, they stopped doing so. And he said Zoom meetings are just not the same. So even though he very much wants to reconnect, but he can't do so because of his family members and church friends' lack of willingness to do so or as much as in the past. Okay. But fortunately for Samuel, he had another group of friends, university friends from the past, who still reconnect regularly to go hiking. So this is why we say the diversity of your social infrastructures are important. And some can become more prominent, and less prominent depending on changing life episodes. So fortunately for Samuel, he could actually tap into the peer support from his former classmates. Okay, so the point to highlight here is intentionality matters, but then intentionality also has to be reciprocal. Okay, that's really kind of the second key message that we want to share. All right, so not all forms of loss can be easily replaced. Okay, we said diversity of social infrastructures help, but not all forms of loss can be easily replaced. Okay, so let me end off here. So as we mentioned, infrastructures are not only about buildings and transport, but also social spaces and people. And these social infrastructures matter. They can take the forms of formal or informal social infrastructures. Social infrastructures are dynamic. They may become more or less prominent in an older person's webs of care, depending on changing life circumstances. And the significance of social infrastructures also evolves with time. So I'll end on that note. And I think we're taking Q&A immediately. Yeah. So questions will be answered by the postdocs. Just kidding. But I will call on them for help.
All right, yes, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. I think I can go around the room. If you have a question, raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone.
Hi, Casey. Go easy on me. Thank you.
No, I can't help but wonder whether the concepts you use, infrastructure and webs of care, create a certain sense that things are always better than it looks. So I'm glad you brought spatial breaches in, but I think it is a lot more serious, this idea of breaches as people age. The term aging in place is also a terrible word. It gives a very hopeful narrative that gives a sense that everything is okay. But you're quite right. Towards the end, intentionality is not enough. People withdraw. This idea of social isolation is perhaps less covered in this project.
Yeah. So I think, one of our limitations probably is, and maybe Grace can also help because she helped design this project at the start. Grace is our PhD student. I think our project looks at kind of a more general population, right? We didn't focus on, say, people who are in certain income, low income status, or stay in one room, two room flats only. So one of our limitations is that we cannot speak very meaningfully when it comes to very extreme cases. But clearly, as the case of COVID-19 and spatial breach shows, that social isolation is experienced by older people who are not in those extreme situations too. Okay, so I think maybe the policy intervention here is, as Casey says, not to sort of paint a very rosy picture, but to acknowledge, right, that there are certain circumstances where people will feel like they want to withdraw or they need to withdraw. And in those cases, what kind of supports become available to them? They may not go to the SAC anymore, but they will still go to the coffee shop, right? They may still go to the pub to take walks, etc. So these are the other spaces in which interventions can happen. But of course, not all interventions can be designed, okay? And sometimes it's just ourselves, taking a step out and creating those social networks with others. Yeah. Chitra, yes, there's a mic.
Thank you. So when the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown happened, one of the things that used to irritate me was the fact that, the grandparents can go and visit their families, but what about people who live alone? Because I was living alone. But now that gives me a completely different perspective on this. So thank you for that. But my question is really about the children. And it's a really interesting flipping of the relationship where it's now the child that determines where the parent can go. And I'm kind of wondering what is that dynamic of that relationship and that change that helps us, like how does it make us understand then space for older adults differently?
Yeah.
And maybe did you follow up on those like
Mm.
kind of ways in which just curious.
Okay, so I brought up this QR code because, as I said, this presentation is based on a paper that's recently published. And one of the key things that we ended up talking about when we first submitted it, we didn't think about it that way, but the reviewers pointed us in this direction. And one of the key things we brought up is the vulnerability paradox, right? So here you have the state thinking, I'm protecting the older person from potential biological threats, but actually you are entrenching also the risk of social isolation. And as you had also mentioned, giving children that disciplinary power, I admit I'm probably guilty of that too, at the height of COVID-19. But I think I came to realize that my father resisted, right? All the reminders, don't do this, don't do that. And in the end, we're just like, go do whatever you want, okay? Just make sure you wear your mask, okay? So I think, it's a process of negotiation, but it does, at that point in time, I think, children had more disciplinary power over their parents, but older parents practice agency as well, going back to this point about agency. Yeah, so, whether or not we followed up, unfortunately, we concluded our research, I think, when did we conclude our research? Earlier this year? Was it? Last year? Okay, yeah. So we haven't followed up further, yeah, but who knows, there's many more threats, yeah, to go, yeah.
I would be interested to hear, did you a further study of a very large group because you had single cases, but I suppose that you need a kind of tendency to figure out, what kind of social infrastructure is good for which kind of people.
Yeah.
And I'm doing a lot of research in city spaces and open spaces. I also worked a lot in Singapore for parks like Bijan Am Mokyo Park.
Mm.
And I did always study actually how does social infrastructure work?
Mm.
So where do people come together? What is actually supporting what not?
Mm.
I would be interested, how do you look into, first of all, different groups on a larger scale? And what kind of infrastructure spaces are supporting health?
Okay, so I think it's helpful that this study actually had a survey, which my previous study didn't. So I think, through the survey actually consists of maybe 3 distinct parts. One was on name generators to map out social networks. The second was actually on the facilities. We call it facilities in the survey, but actually they are social infrastructures, like the ones listed here. Where are the spaces where these participants actually meet the people they name in their social networks? So if we drill into the survey, we are actually able to, as you put it, right, look at how different groups, say for example, men and women, is there a difference in the kind of social infrastructures they use? The third part of the survey is on mental health, right? And we haven't actually started to analyze that. So there's a lot more work to be done there. What's really nice and surprisingly for us, in a good way, was the survey findings actually ended up really matching well with our qualitative findings, right? So the qualitative research was based on a subset of the survey, but sometimes when people fill in surveys, we've also found when people fill in surveys, it may not actually reflect what they say later on, but the spaces that we talked about here, coffee shops, parks, hawker centers, SACs, were the ones that the survey also found to be significant social infrastructures. So we do need to look into this in a more systematic way. Currently, with only Vincent, who's done the survey analysis, he's done some analysis on live alone seniors, and then we've got another qualitative paper on live alone seniors as well. And the 2 sets of findings actually speak really well. So if people are interested, actually, we're holding an end of project workshop on the 23rd and 24th of May. We've not announced it publicly yet, but we'll be sharing a fuller set of our survey research findings during that event. So do keep in touch, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I think we have time for just one
Okay.
quick question.
Hi, I have a quick question about kind of related to this. How much did you worry about self-reporting and the honesty in self-reporting? I imagine that some people might claim to be more socially connected than they actually are, and they might not want to admit to a younger person taking a questionnaire about how isolated they are.
Yeah, so that's why mixed methods are important because we actually did find exactly that. So I think at least 1 or 2 people that we had done qualitative research with, the interviews that go along GPS tracking, when we compared our findings, the qualitative findings with his survey report, right, the self-reporting, they actually didn't match up. So he said he was very well connected, I think, in the survey findings. But with this particular person, when we did the actual, it's pseudonym, Tanaf. Yeah, when we did the actual qualitative fieldwork, we found that actually his social circles were quite small. So that's why the follow-up fieldwork after the survey is important, right, to get the other side of the picture. But of course, you know, the qualitative field is with a small sample size, so we cannot extrapolate, you know, to the rest of them. Yeah. Okay, thank you all very much. If you have any questions, I will not be able to stay for long, but if you have any questions, the postdocs will be here, so you can approach them. But if you also do want to stay in touch to come to our end of project workshop in May, please leave your contact details with either our RAs or our postdocs and we'll follow up with you. Okay, thank you.
So next up is Dr. Ho Kong Chong. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology here at N.U.S. and Head of Urban Studies at Yale-NUS College. A University of Chicago trained urban sociologist, Dr. Ho's research interests are in the political economy of cities, housing, neighborhoods, community, youth, and international education. An author of many books and an investigator on multiple active research projects, Dr. Ho's talk today poses critical questions about segregation and inclusion in Singapore's public housing neighborhoods. As a global city, Singapore.
Believe all of that.
Our illustrious speaker, Dr. Ho. Yes, how can infrastructural design and everyday practices interact to create a more inclusive neighborhood? Let us welcome Dr. Ho.
Thank you. I was close to finishing the PowerPoint where a video came up that made it a much better introduction. So can I get you to play the video? I thought you need a break and watch something in motion.
So speaking of this whole idea of public housing as a social good, rather than just infrastructure, right? Absolutely. HDB has also taken steps recently to integrate rental communities into BTO and bought flats. And there's been some feedback where there are people who feel that this is not the right step. What do you have to say about that? Through estate design and infrastructure provision, we have this opportunity to achieve important social goals. Because in society, there will always be some of these invisible forces at play. That you leave it to society, you leave it to market forces, it will stratify, it will gentrify, people will live separate lives altogether. If you don't live even next to each other, then you won't even have the chance to interact in those micro interactions in the lift, in the corridor, in the market. Then how do you even build social cohesion? It will just be lip service. You must create the opportunities. Yes, there will be friction. Yes, there will be unhappiness from time to time. But by and large, people learn to get along and they thrive in celebrating diversity. I think with good programming, with good neighborliness, with Singaporeans very open to inclusiveness and diversity and just embracing each other, I think we will want to make this work.
Thank you. I think I can end my talk now. But Minister Desmond has brought up a number of important points that actually feature quite centrally in my talk. The first is about preference, right? It's about preference. And so I've cited three pieces of work going back as far as 2003. And the most recent one is this year, using very different methodologies, using very different data sets, but essentially arriving at the same conclusion that if you leave people to choose, they will always choose to live among themselves. All right. So if you're just going with preferences, and the HDB housing is by preference because you can buy, you can choose. Then there will be a gradual segregation, although I think the EIP controls that, but there'll be a gradual resegregation along ethnic and social class lines. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. And the minister said that if you leave that to market forces, then these kinds of things will happen. Now, the second thing is perhaps, hey, why? Not work. Next slide. Okay. So the second thing is something quite interesting. It's something a bit more controversial. This is a piece that I did with also Elaine's collaborator, Vincent Chua. We looked at the social attitudes of Singaporeans data set. It's got a nice set of data going back several years, and so we could check things over time. But the most important thing that this data set has, which makes it unique, is that it compares private housing with public housing. Very important. For the first time, we are able to see differences. And so these 2 points are extremely important. That we found that public housing residents have a stronger set of neighborly sentiments. And secondly, there's stronger support for multi-ethnic neighboring. Something is going on. And that is what the minister was trying to say when it comes to estate planning. That if you have within your abilities the planning supports to create public housing estates that are multicultural in terms of mixing and in terms of social class mixing, which is what we have, then over time, and this is the controversial part, this is the social engineering part, you are able to change attitudes. When people come together and live among each other, they may resist this at first, but over time, they accept this, right? And this is the turning point we are at in terms of housing policy. In the past, we put rental blocks, we put rental families in rental blocks and owner families purchase flats in purchase blocks. We've always done that. But for the first time 5 years ago, we put rental families with owner families together. It's a very progressive policy. It's a mindset shift. This is real. These are all real. Okay, Marsiling, Greenview, Fernvale, Alexandraville. They're all real. But I want to highlight to you the kinds of planning that we need to do. The first is the composition. How much rental units should you be putting within one block? 15%, 21%, 9%. Okay, that's the first. We don't have because this is new, we don't have a golden rule. It's still in the process of experimentation and evolution. The second thing, and even more challenging, very interesting to geographers. Like that, or like that. Okay, there's a fourth version that is polka dotted. We call it polka dotted because it could be random. And in the HDB population, we actually have polka dotted designs because there are historically these things called sitting tenant schemes, where after a while, you can purchase your rental unit. And so over time, you have some random assortment of people who chose to buy and chose to stay. And so you have that. So what is perfect? This is an actual study in Chicago done by these two chaps. 3 different projects. And they divided it into rental units. I think these are subsidized. These are market rates. So you can see, this is the easiest to see. These are the proportions. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. In Brinshaw, is overwhelmingly rental, right? 63%. And then in community builders, it's this set of proportions. What are some of the findings of mixing units? I think this is the most important, right? Especially in the Chicago context where if you look at housing projects, they become collection grounds for the poorest segments of the city, and the most, in many cases, the most dangerous segments. So crime, gangs, drugs happen there. And so this idea of moving rental units to within owner projects, this is the most important thing. It gives families a decent fighting chance for children to grow up in stable environments. And having a decent chance at school and progress. This is more realistic. I mean, you don't expect 2 very different social groups to come together and sing Kumbaya and get the kind of community that that perhaps Elaine was talking about. It just doesn't happen. But there are some modest expectations that there's some interactions. It's not that clear. Of course, there are always some tensions because the poorer families, because of the size of their units, they end up monopolizing common areas. Okay, so that's that. Okay, I want to say a bit more about everyday neighborly processes that occur within HDB estates. Like I said, just putting people together doesn't ensure strong neighboring. But my point, it's a point that I've been making for a long time, is to work with a minimal neighboring model. All right? Forget about Ho and Chua, but and forget about Ho and Wong. This actually is very close to Elaine's work, that there are, if you have elderly residents in rental estates, rental blocks, they tend to help out each other. So there's some support for her work. But I think 3, A, B, and C are really important. And it talks about the minimal model that I was referring to. So when you put rental units and owner units together, you don't expect very strong relationships. Some will happen, but the majority may not, right? But it's the spaces outside that are important. this diversity that Walter talks about is really important. So you don't necessarily have to interact, but the fact that I see you and you're from a different group, it is in itself very important, because it breaks down all the other assumptions that I might have of you if I've never met you in everyday life, right? So this is important. This and these are all connected to this, that you don't have to be doing co-mingling, but the fact that you know each other creates a certain tolerance. And actually, I just came across this, and I'm having this ongoing conversation with Felicity Chan from SUTD to talk about this idea of indifference to difference. That if you have a group of people who are different, living close to each other, as the minister say, encountering each other at the lift lobbies, at the void decks, at the floor segments, all right? Chances are you become more indifferent to difference. And that itself is a good thing, okay? My last slide, maybe the shortest presentation. Here, what about the private housing market? We have absolutely no policy levers with regard to the private market, right? Because you buy according to where you want to live, and so it becomes an open question. But I think I really don't think you need to control that. I think there should be a balance between there should be a balance with regard to some flexibility when it comes to housing choices. So the conclusion is quite obvious. It's important. This idea of inclusive neighborhood, including neighborhoods. I think our schools are doing a good job, but schools only capture the youth segment, right? And the neighborhood actually captures all your lives, apart from work and school. And that's where you see your neighbors. So I think that is important. I think to have the inclusive neighborhood says a lot. So I agree with the minister that if you want an inclusive society, if inclusiveness becomes a mainstream policy, then surely mixed blocks is really the way to go. I talked briefly about supports in design and practice. I think I'll take less than that. The amenities you have at the neighborhood, the playgrounds, the exercise corners. Elaine talked about the coffee shops. They're all important. They're all important in supporting neighborly encounters, not necessarily interaction, but encounters. And I say again, co-presence is extremely important, right? If I see somebody from a different group in the playground with his or her children, I think that is enough. That is a minimal condition for me to understand the other, right? So these kinds of supports and practices and the provisions of amenities within the neighborhood is extremely important. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions.
Thank you so much for the excellent sharing. I think my question, which is think about during your lecture and when I see your final slide, is also serve as a comment. So my background in urban planning, and I recently noticed that. So the most recent concept plan, which is talking about one thing, which is trying to do in the next 10 years, try to put more land parcel, which is for private housing in predominantly public housing place. Another thing they want to try to do is for the historically more the places with more private housing, they will try to put HDB blocks there. So which I think follow up this will be, what do you think that will change the social fabric? And I think another thing which will be sure is that kind of mixing will be in a state level rather than like within like a neighborhood or like within a building. So whether do you think this kind of mixing will work? Thanks.
So that's an interesting comment. Putting private housing in public neighborhoods and vice versa. See, the real problem with private housing are the gates. If I were the chief planner, I would enact a law that says condos should not have gates. And actually, you know, there are instances in the rest of the world that has that. Okay, so the problem with gates is that the residents of the private can go out and enjoy all the amenities, but it's not the other, right? And it doesn't work. It's a one-way kind of interaction.
Thank you for this presentation. I think it's really very relevant also for many parts of the world. Vienna has a very interesting concept. They have about 80% of people are living in housing which they actually don't own, but they are renting it. And it's also interesting that Vienna had historically always put private owners and the public owners side by side, so that you actually create inclusion.
Yeah.
My question is, because looking around the world, we have more and more polarization in our society, especially in regions where you have not the inclusion concept of living. How resilient is there research, especially when, for example, if you have private homes, you have in Australia, you have in Europe, you have in America, where very rich people are very lonely. And it's always a problem if they are not anymore in their best position in life. If they get older, very often they are lonely, they have lots of social problems, and no one takes care of them because they're so alone. So that's a typical question about how resilient is a society, in which types of forms. Is there any research done comparing, for example, HDB housing or concepts in Singapore to, let's say, single private lonely homes?
Not that I know of, but one of the things that we're beginning to do, so I was involved with a group from architecture to plan Paya Lebar Air Base. And one of the things that we're doing is to make sure the elderly gets integrated with younger families. And they get to do that at mid-level housing, not the super high-rise types, because it's very important for them to have access to the street level, because that's where all the interaction occurs. So we try to do that. There are actually in thinking about that, we have many examples from Europe to look at these kinds of mixed communities that are not single age types, but with a bit more mixing and without the gates. And that seemed to be working quite well. Yes, Chitra.
All right, yeah, we have time for a few more questions.
Okay, thank you. So I was thinking about the premise of modernist architecture, right, which was about this radical equality, and which is really this really nicely comes back with bringing in rental housing. And I was wondering about experiments in housing design. Like, how does this then play in relation to the way that HDB design changes over time? Is there something to do with, because you had shown that, you know, there are blocks of houses and then you can arrange them in different ways. And I'm just wondering like exactly how that plays out in terms of the ways in which HDB is planned and designed. If you could talk a little bit more of that.
Yeah. Early days, Chitra, early days, because if you're asking me about actual design, it'll be it'll be very difficult for me to comment because we don't have the research, the data to show that those three are really built. So it'll be great if somebody goes in, a PhD student here thinking about your topics. I'll be happy to supervise a PhD topic that looks into how design affects interaction, right? The vertical, the horizontal, and the polka dotted would all give you very different outcomes, I would imagine. But which outcome is optimal in facilitating interaction, I don't know.
If I may exercise my chair's privileges, I had a question just about what are, like, I'm very new to Singapore. What are the assumptions we're making about owners versus renters? I mean, owners are presumably Singaporean citizens, right? Are the renters presumed to be Singaporeans who are not in a position to own, or are they presumed to be non-Singaporean or PR?
Right. So the rental category, I was referring to Singaporean citizens who earn below, I think, $1,800 household income, and they would be eligible for rental housing. And so this idea of mixed housing then brings the poorest 15-20% segment in contact with, you know, all the rest of society. It's good, but there are other kinds of issues that needs to be adjusted. The units tend to be smaller, so there tends to be a lot more cluttering in the corridors. The family units tend to be larger, and so there's a lot noisier. And there's a lot more hanging out because the units are smaller. So these are things that need adjustment. But as Minister said, I think the trade-off is there. If we build these kinds of designs and it works, then the mixing has its own advantages.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Ho. All right, next up, we have Dr. Chitra VENKATARAMANI. She is assistant professor at N.U.S. Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Her research interests include environmental anthropology, visual studies, science and technology studies, cities design, non-humans landscape, and comics. Dr. Venkataramani.
Chitra, that's fine.
Chitra.
Yeah, I go by V Chitra anyway.
Okay. Dr. V Chitra talk today is about the Singapore Spatial and how the interplay between Singapore's particular housing infrastructure, foster care programs, and the dogs in them have shaped this unique breed. The study asks provocative questions about biological reproduction, infrastructures and imaginaries of care, citizenship, and legitimacy in canine-human relationships. Chitra, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to stand here because I'm going to read out, and both my hands are occupied. So this talk is about how housing infrastructure in Singapore is fast reshaping dogs as companionate beings and also reshaping dog communities. There are a few things I would like to just say at the outset, which is that this work was done during the pandemic as a short project and draws on my experience as a volunteer dog fosterer for an animal welfare organization in Singapore. Over the last couple of years, I've worked with Nur Stasha Wong, a graduate of our political science department, and I was also aided by Vanessa Ong, a graduate of our department who joined via the Europe scheme, and I acknowledge them as my co-authors. I want to just give a trigger warning because the paper mentions animal death, trapping, and caging animals. And I'm going to start my paper now, which in keeping with the general norm in anthropology begins with a story. I used to think that my former foster dog, pictured here, Penguin, was her name, was odd. I do not remember a single moment when she wasn't thinking about escape. She often made daring attempts that have left teeth marks on my door handle. Sorry, juggling lots of things. Sometimes she would escape in the abstract, stare out of her living room window and imagine her free life in the city. The very first time that I met Penguin, my friend Carrie, who was a very experienced fosterer, had come over to help since I had only ever fostered easy dogs. Carrie warned me, must double leash la. If she gets loose, she's going to for sure bolt. She eventually did get loose late one night due to a series of events that are etched in my brain, and I revisit them frequently. I was sitting in the lobby of my apartment block. I was with Penguin and my dog Bubbles. Bubs' arch enemy entered the lobby from the other side. He lunged. I was frazzled. I dragged the two dogs to the other side of the lobby. I dropped the leash. Penguin and I made eye contact. She knew. She bolted and was gone in a second. A black dog into a dark forested park at night. I didn't stand a chance. What followed were 9 months of acute stress. It was early 2020, and in the raging pandemic, search parties were out of the question. I began walking the streets at night and put up posters in the neighborhood and online, which turned out to be a really bad idea. It resulted in panic 3 a.m. phone calls of Penguin sightings and online trolls who hounded me to find her. Eventually, the local cat feeders informed me that she was coming over to the apartment area to eat the cat food. We set up a trap and I'd leave food. I was hopeful that I would catch her. But the pandemic had other plans for us. As human activity slowed down, the animals and plants began crossing established boundaries. Weeds grew on paths. Otters explored beyond their familiar streams and dined on expensive fish, resulting in public calls to cull the murderous otter population. And this is from very recent times, and this dog, who's a Singapore special, did not manage to, deal with the otters. I'll come back to that. My neighborhood McDonald's, like other restaurants, was shut down. The small pack of stray dogs that depended on the McDonald's began to roam and found my penguin trap. This created a panic among the cat feeders. Penguin was friendly with the cats. She also had a collar which marked her as belonging to someone. The stray dogs, unlike Penguin, the stray dogs were 3 sisters who were named Itsy, Bitsy, and Mitzi. They were collarless and hence seen as feral and dangerous. The death of a civet cat brought things to a head. The body of the animal laid in a clearing, and the cat feeders were certain that the feral dogs were to blame. They took to patrolling the apartment complex at night, armed with a bat to kill the dogs. My penguin trapping activities had to be relocated, and we eventually managed to move to the edge of a main road, which was quite dangerous, actually. By then, Penguin had learned to bolt when she saw me. To avoid detection, Bubs and I would perch on the overpass from close to midnight to 2 a.m. nearly every day for 9 months, waiting for her to emerge from the wooded areas and rummage in the dustbins for food. So if I didn't get any writing done in 2020, it's because of this. As the months passed, Kerry set me up with an experienced trapper, Yun-Shi, who at the time was feeding, trapping, and fostering multiple dogs, apart from also helping me out. And this is very common in the dog fostering community and forms these communities and webs of care. I could talk more about that as well. We set up all kinds of traps, but Penguin evaded us. Penguin learned to identify Yun-Shi's truck. She learned to check the bridges and roads for us. She would patrol up and down, and if she spotted us, she would bolt back into the woods. The 3 a.m. calls from strangers grew to a fever pitch as they accused me of cruelty and abandonment. The posts about the stray dog menace, too, took on a similar intensity. As Singapore began rolling back pandemic restrictions, the animal lives were ushered to different conclusions. Weeds were cut back, pangolins rescued, chickens ushered out of the subway. Itsy and Mitzi, Bitsy died as cars came back on the road, were trapped in a local park, and from there, they were sent to the pound, after which we had hit a dead end. with their stories, because once they are trapped, classified, and put in their proper institutional place, it was as if the story had reached its proper conclusion. The story does not have a good end for me either, but it does for Penguin, which I guess is more important. All the dogs, Penguin, Itsy, Mitzi, and Bitsy, fall into a broad category called the Singapore Special. This is a term used to describe mongrel dogs in Singapore. The process of losing Penguin and trying to trap her made me gain a closer understanding of how these terms, Singapore Special, stray, feral, or domestic, make flesh in nature culture, as Donna Haraway writes. Crucial to this is public housing infrastructure and policy, which determines canine conduct, community, and fate. The role of fosterers and other animal welfare professionals is then to mediate between housing policy, human inhabitants, and the dogs to secure belonging in the island nation state. I'm still writing this article, so the project isn't finished yet because I had to finish my book. But what I want to talk about today is how terms of companionship are inseparable from citizenship and from the built landscape of the city. This is evident in the ways in which dog and human co-becoming are made conditional and depend on inclusion in public housing schemes. While this might, on first blush, appear as a case rooted in the particularities of the Singaporean context, urban planning and environmental expertise are one of the island city's most successful exports. And I think that there is a lesson to be learned here. This makes an interesting site to ask how interspecies relations and animals are shaped socially, politically, and even biologically. And I'll get to that, as a result of highly technical plans oriented around human wants. Singapore's Housing Development Board, HDB, and I know I'm talking to a an audience that already knows all of this, was established in 1960. As the first blocks came up, animals that were a part of families and farms had to be abandoned. In its first report, the HDB states that the keeping of domestic animals and poultry is unsuitable for in-housing estates where families live in close proximity to each other, particularly in compact multi-storied flats. This is from the annual report. The Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, RSPCA, later the SPCA, began collecting animals by the truckloads. In the 1960s, it was collecting upwards of 3,000 animals a month, a number that declined over the years with the culling programs. By 1990, the majority of the island's population of 2.5 million people then was residing in HDBs. The HDB had, in the 1970s, relented to public demands and allowed one dog per household, but there were caveats. The dog had to be a toy breed, and it published a list of breeds it considered acceptable for apartment life. It introduced other rules and regulations regarding dangerous breeds and banned breeds. And there are many cases of newspaper reports of people having to give up their family dogs, which didn't fall into these categories. And one beautiful story is that after the licensing regimes were put in place, people had to go there and get licenses for their puppies that they thought were toy breeds. So an officer would have a photo album, and you had to point to the photo album and say, my dog is that breed. But sometimes the dog would grow to become much larger and clearly of a different breed. And then there would be this tension, like, you gave me the license for this dog, and now you're saying I can't have this dog. And the stories are spectacular and also heartbreaking. So throughout this time, the local population of mongrel dogs was not deemed worthy of inclusion in public housing, though there are enough reports of people feeding them and keeping them anyway. And here neighborliness is so important. And until very recently, culling programs remained the state's primary method of controlling the local dog population. There are a few important factors that led to the move from culling to sterilization, the TNRM program, which stands for Trap, Neuter, Release, and Manage. The TNRM program is in Singapore an Australian import. Then teams of Australian and Singapore scientists began to conduct a study to understand dog ecology, territorial range, and reproduction rates in Singapore. And if I can only find a cursory report about this, kind of reference to this, if somebody comes across this report, please let me know. Thus, changing ideas and scientific frameworks of animal management introduced new methods of biological control. The second important factor was the establishment of a strong network of animal welfare groups that were able to introduce ideas of positive training. They were able to use social media to rally public support anytime the state put out tenders to cull dogs. And lastly, they were also able to build a network of fosterers who are willing to take in dogs and act as mediators to introduce feral mongrels into society. And actually, a lot of this has to do with negotiating with neighbors, especially in HDBs. Backing for this change came in 2014 when the government allowed the NGOs to start a pilot scheme called Project Adore, Adoption and Rehoming of Dogs. Under this scheme, mongrels that were under 50 centimeters high and less than 15 kilos would be allowed in HDBs, but with caveats. Project Adore has been incredibly successful, and part of its success can be attributed to the way it rebrands, and I put this in air quotes, local dogs as Singapore specials, firmly rooting their belonging as Singaporean. Its success is also due to fosters who work with individual dogs. For example, Singapore specials adopted into HDBs must go through and pass a good, say, canine citizen program, which is not required of dogs bought from breeders, by the way. To make attractive candidates for adoptions, fosters like me will often work with dogs, and this I do a lot with senior dogs especially, in order to reduce return rates or future abandonment. Since 2014, animal welfare groups have slowly tweaked the landscape of regulations, first by raising the height limit to 55 centimeters, doing away with the weight limit. Then they were able to convince the government to do away with the weight limit. They were also able to add retired police dogs and military dogs, like Danny, the one who failed at catching otters, who used to be put down upon completion of service. These changes have been possible because of the growing popularity of Singapore specials and the idea that they are a distinct Singaporean breed, which are exclusively reserved. The move from mongrel to Singapore special made inclusion within the housing programs, which are exclusively reserved for Singaporean citizens, permanent residents, possible, but of course, with certain controls regarding numbers in place. In the last decade, specials have become highly popular and they've taken also a distinct identity. Specials have a reputation for being skittish, for having food allergies and high anxiety, words that sound like they were taken from a breed description page. And yeah, that's like a breed description of the Singapore special. One of the debates I often have with other fosterers and volunteers when I interview them is whether the Singapore special is a bureaucratic category, like my visa status, or whether it is a breed. Stasha and I were asking another volunteer, Ren, who works as an animal trainer, this question, and she's also a fosterer as well. Ren thought about it before providing the following answer. Perhaps the Singapore special was a breed that resulted from the government's culling and housing program. In the early days, the program killed off all the dogs that were friendly and easily tracked. Ren theorized that those that were left were the ones who had learned correctly to be afraid, who, when the leash was dropped, like Puffin, to run into the dark forest and to stay away from humans who sought to trap them. Dogs that learned to navigate the boundaries created by human dwelling. In the last few years, the state has drastically reduced support for animal welfare groups and reduced the area allotted for housing dogs within those groups. Yes, I'm very close to the end. This makes fosters even more important as they have to take in the dogs that can't be accommodated in the kennels. Once in their care, the fosters teach the dogs to become good citizens and to learn to inhabit public housing. In so doing, fosters become key mediators of the state's project, often using rudimentary understanding of behavior modification techniques to coach the dogs. This year, the government set up a small pilot facility specifically for Singapore specials, which Stasha and I visited. The facility houses 70 dogs, roughly 70 dogs, and its main office replicates a typical Singaporean home in an HDB. Despite my many efforts, I did not get permission to interview the staff or conduct participatory observation at the facility. So everything I'm showing you is regarding this program is from publicly available sources. So this is a place where the center mimics a typical Singaporean home. The TV is kept on, and the friendly staff eats their meals at the dining table. The dogs circulate through the space, and they learn to adapt to apartment living, not to bark at passers-by, not to beg for food, to learn to live with sudden loud noises from the TV, and to not knock over things. If they are successful, the dogs are then matched with a family. But as Stasha pointed out to me, there is much left unsaid. If they are not successful, then it is unclear how long the dogs can stay. Behavioral modification may have displaced culling, but it also then manifests as long periods in a cage. In Singapore, a changing terrain of canine regulations has created particular ideas of canine companionship and conduct. The terrain itself is a product of globally circulating ideas of responsibility towards companion species, rights and care, and the changing sciences of animal management. In this context, care, in this context, in Singaporean context, care for mongrels is predicated on the idea that they share a common identity of being Singapore specials. Even with this, belonging is not a given, but something that both humans and dogs have to work on together to slowly tweak this terrain of building regulations. Singapore is not alone in this. In India, in the wake of violent human-canine encounters, private housing cooperatives have begun publishing a list of breeds that are banned, which were taken from Singapore. Simultaneously, Indies, which is what local Indian stray dogs are called, are slowly finding more acceptance. In terms of writing up these research findings, I think I'm heading towards thinking about the ways in which planning and the sciences of animal care manifests in the bodies of our significant others. Unfortunately, these are not plans in which significant otherness is allowed to flourish. Is companionship the right term if it does not make room for the possibility of rejection, the possibility of the feral? To end Penguin's story, she never came back. Though she comes to the apartment complex twice a day at 6:45 a.m. and 8:45 p.m. to get fed by the cat feeders, and then she goes back to the forest. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Anyone, any questions?
Hi, thank you for the lovely talk. I just wanted to ask if you think that we should keep these stray dogs stray. Like, for example, in the ideal situation that we can trap all of them and find them great homes. Do you think that it's we should, or do you think that them being stray is like a part of their Singaporean identity, the fact that we see them around us when we go down to the HDB or
one thing is important to note that stray dogs are allowed to be strayed under the TNRM program. So basically, like the idea is to tap, neuter, release, manage. So they'll be outside, and that's how Penguin is allowed to stay. She's kind of now considered a community dog. So this is a very recent change, and at the same time, it's the question of like how. So even if there are a bunch of stray dogs that are, somebody might complain, they might then get trapped, right? If they're trapped, then you have to find a fosterer. Otherwise, they're going to spend the rest of their life in a cage. And this is, I do not have permission to go to Jurong, but there are hundreds of dogs in Jurong Island that are living their entire life. They are going to live their entire lifespan in a cage, whereas they were roaming freely over this petrochemical landscape. And if you want to know more about that, I can put you in touch with Noor Stasha, who's actually doing her dissertation on it.
So Chitra, this is a question related to this very interesting relationship that you have between companionship and citizenship, right? If you're thinking about dogs over the last 50 years, they used to be kept as watchdogs.
Yes.
And so they were very fierce and barking at everything. But over time, as you pointed out, they've become more companions. And I was wondering whether it's a way of thinking of the concept of citizenship, if it is possible for dog societies to create this idea of community dog is interesting, but it doesn't, there are no interactions with the wider community because people are still worried of getting bitten if you approach them.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you would think that their role as citizens or community dogs would be improved if there's actually a campaign to have to change the public thinking about petting dogs, petting these dogs, and actually petting other dogs. I say that because You know, I've just become a grandfather. Whenever I bring my grandchild to the park, all of a sudden I've got neighbors who never met me before, and they become very friendly to me because of my baby. And they would, you know, they would play with the baby. But if I were to bring a dog to the park, I'm less sure, unless they're dog owners, I'm less sure that they will play with my dog.
Yeah. Yes. That is actually very important, and it gets to one of the important points about that the paper is trying to make. And this, a lot of the multi-species scholars also write about this. Donna Haraway, in her book, she writes about how dogs are expected to automatically embrace that companionship, and you know, in some sense, that companionship is kind of a burden on that dog in a sense, because it immediately then requires certain forms of conduct. And so the reason I hesitate about petting is that then it would require the dog to not bite, whereas we are now we are asking what is the possibility of the feral even within the companionate, right? Like if I accept some creature as a companion, what kinds of possibilities do I make room for, and what are the ways in which their inclusion in housing policy demands them to embrace, to take on certain identities and subjectivities, and you know that.
And that may not be in their nature.
Yeah, well, even if it is not, or you know, we can argue that what is nature versus like what we were socialized into for but so in some sense maybe the dogs that you know have only known this kind of good canine conduct is they're happy, and it's a question of like, how do we make room for those that do reject that?
That's right.
And I think that's very important because it speaks to our capacity for otherness.
Indeed.
All right, please join me in thanking Chitra for this
Thank you.
fascinating and wonderful presentation. All right, lastly, we have Dr. Nala Lee, who will be presenting our closing remarks.
It'll be very quick, don't worry. So sorry I couldn't be here for the whole event. I just come from a meeting with the president. But it's all, thank you so much. The Singapore Research Nexus is very thankful to presenters for today's presentations and for you audience for your participation. The conversation does not have to end here, whether it be the care of older adults or whether it be our special relationship with Singapore Specials, as well as aeromobile automation, or even, what was the last one? Okay, hang on. This is what happens when you come from another talk. Or whether it be inclusive neighborhood design. Wow, well, so we invite you to think about the sorts of implications that, you know, the findings from today may have for making policies down the road, and the conversations can continue from there. I won't hold you back further. There are refreshments outside. So we invite you to go out, mingle, and have a conversation, and then we'll hope to see you again. So this draws the event to a close. Thank you.